rejected by her lover and denied by her father.
Damory and Tanar laid in the grass on top of coarse blankets stripped from beneath each of their horses' saddles. Their bodies were strewn across the blankets, legs intertwined, hands clasped, and Damory's face nuzzled into Tanar's neck. Her hooded robe and veils had been cast aside and lay at the hooves of her horse. She was wrapped in Tanar's robe, with her arms, legs, and face fully exposed. The sun, still partially hidden by dark clouds, glistened off her shiny hair and refracted off her eyes each time she looked up to breathe in Tanar's face once more. The wind had started to pick up, signaling an oncoming storm. Damory shivered. "Are you cold, my love?" Tanar asked with a voice so sweet and caring it almost made Damory cry. "No, my lord," she said. "I am not bothered by the chill in the air. I am warm here beside you." She looked up to see his face again. "You must stop calling me my lord," he joked. "Anything else sounds unfamiliar and inappropriate," she admitted. "Call me Tanar and I shall call you Damory. Other names and titles matter not." "But what if certain titles and status matter most, Tanar?" Tanar shrugged and dismissed the question. "What other titles matter besides king, a title which my father holds, and one which I shall hold someday as well?" Damory shrugged. She had no answer to his question, but her stomach still felt uneasy. Suddenly her body stiffened. She jerked up and looked into the distance. "What is it, Damory?" Tanar asked, searching the distance. Damory jumped up and hastened to put on her robe and cloak. "Hoofbeats! Someone approaches and they ride with urgency, my lord." Tanar stood to his feet and grabbed his sword. He looked all around but could see nothing. "Where? From what direction?" he begged. "From the east," she said confidently. Tanar scanned the horizon and spotted a rider approaching at a full gallop. He quickly dressed and stood between the rider and his pinto that grew uneasy at the sound of the thundering hoofbeats. Damory slid her hood on and covered her face with the veil. She drew her sword and stood beside Tanar waiting. She had no idea what she would do to the mystery rider, but she knew she would die before she let anything happen to Tanar. Suddenly, Tanar lowered his sword and stepped forward. He squinted at the approaching rider and was alarmed when he recognized the crest of Hangvat on the rider's saddle. Damory followed Tanar's lead and lowered her sword. As the rider got closer, he slowed his horse to a trot and approached them. She didn't know the man's face, but she was certain that Tanar did. The rider was the steward sent by King Nation. "Steward, why do you ride so hard?" "Prince Tanar, the kingdom is under siege by raiders," the steward began. "There are more than I have ever seen. Their numbers were doubled by traitors inside the kingdom. Hangvuit is near its end, my lord. It will certainly fall. The king wants you to ride north to safety. He desires that you never return to Hangvuit." Damory's heart sank as she imagined the end of Hangvuit and all that King Nation had built. Tanar had a different perspective. There was a war taking place in his home and he wasn't there. His chest heaved as anger consumed him. He glanced at Damory, and for the first time in hours, she found herself avoiding his eyes. His expression was dark and haunted, and Damory felt afraid. Without another word, Tanar leapt on his horse and sped past the steward, galloping east toward Hangvuit. Damory mounted her horse and sped after him. The steward dismounted and took a moment to examine the blankets left behind in the grass. He looked over his shoulder at Tanar and Damory galloping away. Then he looked before him, to the north. Ahead was a land free from raiders, kings, legends, and prophecies. He struggled with the doubt in his mind for a moment, and then he shook it off. He mounted his stallion, and he too rode off toward Hangvuit. The night had already fallen when Tanar, Damory, and the steward reached the village at the outer province of Hangvuit. Bodies of raiders, Hangvuit warriors, and townspeople lined the streets. Smoke billowed from still-burning homes. Orphaned children and widowed women wandered the streets praying for miracles, hoping to find a loved one still alive. The house of Hangvuit Castle in the distance seemed eerily quiet. Tanar dug his heels into his stallion and raced through the village towards his home. The other horses followed obediently, taking Damory and the steward with them. The trio arrived at the decimated courtyard where dead warriors still lay splayed in the paths and alleyways. Tanner dismounted and ran through the main gate and into the main court. Tanner and Domary rushed inside and saw Zan seated on the ground holding Nashen in his arms. There was a pool of blood beneath the king and his captain, and it was impossible to see who it came from. At first glance, however, it was clear that Nasian was mortally wounded. Tanner raced to his father's side, fearful of seeing his last breath escape his body. Tamori watched and erupted in tears. As Tanner inched closer, Nasian opened his eyes. Tanner smiled with delight and knelt beside him. "Father, forgive me. I should have been here, fighting by your side," he whispered with the most gentle and humble voice he'd ever used. "No, my son." Nasian's voice was weak as he choked on his words. "Forgive this old fool for his mistakes, and know that I gladly go to the next life so you may remain in this one."
"No, father, you will not die. You cannot."
"It is the glory of all men to pass from his life, my son. There is no better dismissal from this world than that which comes in battle." "Your father fought more bravely and with a more ferocity than any man I have ever known, Tannar," Zan added. Nashin held out his outstretched arm past Tanner to Damori. He motioned her over, and she knelt at his side. He weakly lifted his hand and caressed the edge of her veil. "Damori," he smiled weakly. "My sweet girl, I wish you were mine." Damori stifled a powerful sob that made her body heave, and she clutched his hand and held it to her bosom. "I am yours, most honorable King Nasian," she blurted. "You must go." His voice was trailing off. Damori could see the light in his eyes going dim forever. "Kaelin and I spoil our homes with a senseless war, while a disease has festered among us. Go! The raiders will surely attack Kaelin at Nyanzavet. You must protect Empress Shayla and Princess Mieko." Nation exhaled his last breath and closed his eyes. Tana laid his father's head down and turned to Damori, who was already adjusting her clothing and sword in preparation for her ride to Nyansvet. Tana stood behind Damori. He sensed there was something more to the conversation between Nasian and Damori. "Why would you care about Nyansvat and Kaelin?" he demanded. Damori could feel him glaring behind her. Damori found herself avoiding his piercing gaze again, but she knew it was time Tana knew not just pieces of the truth, but all of it. "King Kaelin is my king," she began. "I am handmaid to the queen and the princess. I am a servant of Nyansvet." Tana stumbled back, shocked. His fists clenched at the excruciating pain of betrayal surged through his body. He grabbed Damori's shoulder and spun her around to face him. "You are the enemy?" His voice was tainted with anger and disappointment, and his question sounded more like an accusation. Damori clasped his hand lovingly to reassure him. Zane and the steward took notice. "No, Tana. No. Do not say such things," she cried. Tana snatched his hand out of hers. His eyes had turned bloodshot from holding back the tears, but his anger was boiling over. He paced at his dead father's feet, slamming his fist into his palm to emphasize his failings and every brutal statement. "What have I done?" he questioned. There was a tinge of horror to his tone. It made the steward step back. "My father was fighting for his kingdom, for his very life, while I gallivant with the slave of my sworn enemy." He cast a scornful look at Damori. This time, she was too hurt to avoid his gaze. She stared back at him, searching her heart for forgiveness. "Is this why you hid your face? To mask your deception?" he bellowed loudly. "I would never deceive you," she exclaimed. "No, you have done far worse. You distracted me and killed my father." "No," she shouted. The mere idea of being the cause of King Nasian's death was far too much to bear, even presented as an angry and weak accusation. She felt her heart tear at the seams. All she wanted at that point was for Tanner to pull her into his bosom with all his might, embrace her and tell her that he was sorry. She could still forgive him, she thought. They could still salvage their love. "No, I would never do that," she uttered again. This time her voice was weak, like the wisp of a final dying breath. "Yes," challenged Tannar as he drew his sword. You support the wretched adversary of my people. Leave now. You are not wanted here. Damori felt her legs shake and her knees buckle. She knew her chest was caving in as she feebly stayed on her feet, even though there was nothing physically crushing her. Still, she was crushed. Her spirit had been suffocated by Tanner's raging accusations. But more than anything, his distrust sapped her spirit, her very life force. It was a familiar feeling. There was King Kaelin, Empress Shayla, and now Prince Tanner. She had been rejected by all. At that very moment, Damori wanted to die. Damori knelt at Tanner's feet and lowered her head. Tears were streaming down her face as she looked up at Tanner, sobbing. I would rather you take my head than to live another moment with the pain in my heart. Tanner lowered his sword and turned away. He felt foolish, immature, and irresponsible, but his pride and his mourning were incendiary infernos to every other emotion coursing through his veins. "Leave now!" he shouted with his back to her. Zan knelt at Damori's side and lifted her to her feet. She snatched her hands away and ran away through the courtyard. Zan made several gestures with his hand towards the steward, who nodded his understanding. He quickly ran after Damori.